There is a place so dark that even demons fear to enter. It's not a cave. It is not a prison made by human hands. It's not just a symbolic image to scare people. It is a place described as a spiritual prison, a place of darkness, chains, and waiting, a place reserved for beings who once stood before glory, but crossed a line that should never have been crossed. And here's the most unsettling detail. The Bible doesn't just talk about demons unleashed. She also talks about imprisoned angels, rebel angels, beings kept in eternal chains, awaiting a judgment that is yet to come. But why? What did they do? What type of sin was so serious that God did not allow it to continue circulating throughout creation? Most people have heard of heaven. Many have heard of hell. But almost no one talks about this other place. Tartarus, the abyss, the prison of fallen angels. And when you start to put the pieces together, something strange appears. Peter mentions these beings. Judas, too. The book of Enoch expands the mystery. And in the New Testament, there is a scene in which the demons themselves seem terrified at the possibility of being sent to this place. Think about it. Creatures that scared men were scared of prison. So the question is inevitable. What's down there? Who is trapped in this place? And why does Revelation speak of a time when the abyss will be opened? Because perhaps the scariest thing is not the existence of this prison. Perhaps the scariest thing is discovering that it won't stay closed forever. There is something hidden in this theme that completely changes the way many people see the spiritual world. Because when we talk about fallen angels, we almost always think of loose beings, deceiving, influencing, and acting in the shadows. But what if part of them wasn't loose? What if some had been locked in a specific place, separated from others, as if what they did was so serious that it required early punishment? This is where the mystery begins. Peter speaks of angels cast into a region of darkness. Jude speaks of beings kept in eternal prisons. And the Apocalypse speaks of an abyss that will be opened. 3 lanes, 3 doors, the same terror, but none of them deliver everything at once. They just leave traces, like footprints in a dark hallway. And the more you follow these footsteps, the more you realize that there is a question behind everything. Why were some fallen angels imprisoned while others remained active? This difference does not seem small. She points to a division for a specific guilt, for an act that exceeded some prohibited limit. And that's exactly what makes this prison so scary. It was not created for any creature. It was reserved for beings who touched something they shouldn't touch, beings who broke an ancient order, beings who, according to very ancient traditions, not only rebelled, but contaminated creation in a profound way. But there is a detail. This prison does not appear as a common place of suffering. She appears as expected, like confinement, like a still incomplete sentence. They are trapped now, but they await something bigger, the trial. And if there is a prison awaiting trial, then there is a story that has not yet ended. A story buried in Scripture, a story that begins with angels falling, but perhaps it ends with the abyss opening. A spiritual prison does not function like a human prison. There are no iron bars. There are no guards walking the halls. There are no common doors, common keys, common walls. And still, no one leaves. This is the point that makes everything weirder. When the Bible speaks of these imprisoned angels, it describes a reality that does not belong to our physical world, but that appears to have authority over spiritual beings. In other words, it is not a prison for bodies. It is a prison for entities, a place where that which is invisible can also be contained. But how can something spiritual be chained? This question opens a dangerous door, because the chains mentioned do not need to be chains like ours. They represent dominance, limit, sentence, a barrier imposed by God. And against this barrier, not even rebellious angels can fight. This is where a lot of people get lost, because it imagines the spiritual world as a place without rules, without order, without borders. But ancient texts show otherwise. There is hierarchy. There is permission. There is judgment. There is a limit. And when this limit is broken, there is punishment. But there is a detail that almost no one notices. These beings were not simply destroyed. They were saved, maintained, reserved, as if there was a date set for something bigger to happen. This changes everything, because this prison is not just punishment. She is waiting. It's containment. It's forced silence. It is as if God had closed a door on ancient creatures and said, "The time has not yet come." But what time is this? And why does this wait span centuries? Maybe because their crime doesn't just involve rebellion. Maybe it involves something deeper, something linked to the corruption of creation, something so serious that it needed to be isolated from the rest of the spiritual world. And that's why, before talking about the abyss, we need to look at a specific name. A rare name, a dark name, a name that appears as an almost hidden clue within the New Testament. Tartarus. Tartarus. This name appears as a small door, but behind it there is a huge corridor. When Peter speaks of the angels who sinned, he uses an idea linked to a deep, dark, inferior region. It is not a simple word thrown into the text. It is as if he points to a specific place of spiritual imprisonment. And that changes the weight of the sentence, because Peter isn't just saying that these angels were punished. He's saying they've been cast down to a prison, to a place of darkness. But why down? Why does this image of depth appear so often when it comes to spiritual judgment? The sky is described as high, the glory above, the presence of God elevated, but Tartarus appears as the opposite: descent, fall, lockdown, darkness. And this is where everything gets more intense, because falling, in this context, is not just losing position. It is to be removed from the divine order. It's leaving the light and being pushed into a region where there is no freedom, there is no mission, there is no return. Just wait. But there is one detail. Peter links this place to angels who sinned, not to common people, not to common demons. Angels, powerful, ancient, conscious beings who knew more than us and yet surpassed a forbidden limit. Then the question arises, what sin was that? What could have been so serious that God not only expelled these beings, but imprisoned them in a region of darkness? The answer is not complete. It comes in pieces. Pedro gives a clue. Judas confirms another. Enoch enlarges the shadow. And when these parts get closer, the image starts to appear. It wasn't just rebellion. It was a border invasion. Something that shouldn't have been touched. Something that made heaven respond with arrest. And Tartarus becomes just that. The place where the rebels' freedom ended, but where their trial has not yet truly begun. Eternal chains. This expression seems simple until you imagine who is trapped in them. They are not human criminals. They are not ancient kings. They are not defeated soldiers. They are angels who have fallen, beings who once knew a superior reality, but are now kept in darkness, as if all their strength had been reduced to silence. And Jude adds a disturbing detail. They did not stand their ground. They abandoned their own place. This suggests a break in order. They left where they were supposed to stay. They invaded a boundary that did not belong to them. And when they did that, something was triggered. Not a warning, not a warning. A prison. But why eternal chains? Because these chains don't just talk about physical strength. They speak of a divine decision that cannot be undone by rebellion, power, or cunning. They may have been strong. They may have been old. They may have seen things that the human mind cannot even imagine. But now they are trapped, waiting. And that wait is perhaps the scariest part, because the text does not say that the trial is over. He says they are saved for judgment. In other words, prison is just the beginning. The final day has not yet arrived. And if these beings are trapped until that day, then something in them remains a threat. Something needed to be contained. Something couldn't remain free. But there is a detail that adds to the mystery. Other evil spirits appear loose in the New Testament. They talk, act. They recognize Jesus. They beg. But these angels do not appear walking the earth. They are isolated, separated, as if they belong to a different category. So the question gets even heavier. What distinguishes these prisoners from the other fallen? Why do some people work in the world while others were buried in darkness? The answer seems to point to an ancient transgression, a rupture so serious that it opened a wound in creation. And to understand this wound, we need to enter a text that has always caused fascination, fear, and debate. The Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch enters into this mystery like an open window into an ancient night. He is not treated the same by all traditions, but he has profoundly influenced religious imagination about fallen angels, watchers, and forbidden beings. And this is where the story gets darker. According to this tradition, certain angels did not just rebel in thought. They went down. They crossed a border. They touched creation in a way they shouldn't touch. And when they did that, something was contaminated. The narrative talks about the watchers, beings who observed, but who left their post. They didn't stay where they were supposed to stay. They looked to the human world and desired something that did not belong to them. Do you see the connection? Jude speaks of angels who did not guard their position. Enoch speaks of beings who abandoned their place. Peter speaks of angels cast into darkness. The pieces start to get closer, but they still don't form the whole picture. Because the scariest point is not just the fall of these angels, it is the result of the fall. According to Enoch, they taught forbidden knowledge, corrupted humanity, and generated disorder that spread across the earth. It was not just individual sin. It was influence. It was contamination. It was a crack entering the world. And if this tradition helps explain why some angels were imprisoned, then imprisonment was not just punishment. It was containment. God was not just punishing rebels. It was stopping something from continuing to spread. But there is one detail. If these beings were imprisoned for crossing a limit, then Tartarus is not just a place of pain. It is a spiritual vault, a place where God locked away that which could not remain loose. And that brings us to an even stranger scene. Because in the New Testament, when Jesus encounters demons, they unintentionally reveal something. They were afraid. But not just Jesus. They were afraid of the abyss. There is a scene in the New Testament that seems small, but it opens a huge crack in the mystery. Jesus encounters unclean spirits, and they know who he is. They recognize authority. They know they are facing someone who can give an order that is impossible to resist. But the scariest detail is not that they recognize Jesus. It is the request they make. They beg not to be sent to the abyss. Think about it. Demons who terrorized people were terrified of a place, not with men, not with soldiers, not with human prisons, with the abyss. Then an inevitable question arises. What was there in that place to cause fear in spiritual beings? The abyss appears as a region of confinement, a background, a depth, a place where certain forces are guarded, limited, prevented from acting freely, and that connects everything. Tartarus, eternal chains, angels trapped, future judgment, abyss. They don't seem like separate ideas. They seem to be names and images pointing to the same spiritual reality, a place where God contains what should not circulate freely. But there is one detail. Demons don't just ask to avoid suffering. They seem to fear losing access to the world, lose movement, lose influence, be removed from the scene, because while they are loose, they can still deceive, disturb, confuse, and destroy. But in the abyss, the action ends. The voice stops. The movement stops. The creature waits. And maybe that's what they fear so much. Not just pain, but confinement, silence, powerlessness before divine authority. And this is where everything changes. If even demons fear this place, then the abyss is not just a dark symbol. It is presented as a real frontier in the spiritual world, a prison that even darkness recognizes. But the question remains open. Who's in there now? And what will happen when that door is opened? What's trapped beneath the darkness? This question does not appear directly, but it cuts through the entire mystery. Because if there is a prison, there are prisoners. And if these prisoners are being held until trial, then they are not just reminders of an ancient rebellion. They are still part of the story, even in silence, even invisible, even far away. Peter speaks of angels who sinned. Jude speaks of beings who abandoned their place. Enoch speaks of watchers who exceeded forbidden limits. And the New Testament shows demons afraid of the abyss. Everything points to the same idea. There are spiritual beings that God has decided to contain. Don't just observe, not just warn, contain. But why contain it? Because some forces, when they are free, don't just attack individuals. They corrupt environments. They distort generations. They spread an influence that goes beyond what the eye can see. And perhaps that is why the prison is described so powerfully. Darkness, chains, abyss. Wait. Every word seems to say the same thing. This cannot circulate freely. But there is an even more disturbing detail. These beings are not described as repentant. They are described as guarded, arrested, reserved for a specific day. This creates enormous tension because the spiritual world is not just divided between heaven and earth. There is also that which was locked, that which was isolated, that which awaits a final sentence. And when we think about it, fear changes shape. Fear is not just imagining what they did in the past. It's imagining what they would still do if they were released. What kind of influence would return? What kind of terror would be released? What kind of darkness would come out of a place where even demons don't want to enter? And this is where the mystery stops looking only backwards. He starts looking at all close. Because the Bible doesn't just talk about a closed abyss. She speaks of a time when it will be opened. And when the abyss opens, the mystery is no longer just ancient. He becomes prophetic. In Revelation, the image is frightening. A door that was closed is opened, and smoke rises from inside it as if a hidden furnace was breathing after a long time in silence. But the strongest detail is not the smoke. That's what comes after. Something comes out of there. Something that was contained. Something that didn't belong on the surface. And then the question arises, why would God allow the abyss to be opened? Perhaps because the opening of the abyss is not an accident. Don't be a failure in prison. Don't be an escape. It's permission. It's judgment. It is the moment when what was kept appears as part of a larger plan. And that changes everything. Because the arrest of the fallen angels doesn't just show the past of the rebellion. It points to the future of the trial. The closed abyss reveals authority. The open abyss reveals consequence. But there is one detail. Revelation does not present this opening as something common. It comes surrounded by signs, impact, and fear, as if the world is seeing the return of something that should never have been free. What was hidden begins to move. What remained silent begins to act. What was stuck enters the story again. And here the tension reaches its highest point. If the abyss can be opened, then prison is not the end of the narrative. It's just a break. A long pause, dark, loaded with silence. And every silence kept for centuries seems to prepare a terrible sound when it is finally broken. Then look at the central idea. Rebel angels were arrested. Demons fear this place. Ancient texts speak of forbidden beings, and Revelation speaks of an opening. The ultimate question is not just what is in the abyss. The question is, what happens to the world when God allows the abyss to respond? In the end, the imprisonment of the fallen angels reveals something much greater than fear. It reveals order. It shows that not even spiritual rebellion is free to do everything it wants. There is a limit, there is authority, there is a hand above the darkness. And perhaps this is the most important part of this whole mystery. Tartarus is not just darkness. The abyss is not just horror. Eternal chains are not just punishment. All of this points to a silent truth. God contains what the world could not face alone. But there is one detail. These beings are not trapped forever without an answer. They are held for judgment. This means that the story is still heading towards a final settlement. Nothing was forgotten. Nothing was lost in the shadows. Nothing escaped God's eyes. And when Peter, Jude, Enoch, and Revelation seem to touch on this same theme, the feeling is clear. There is a deeper spiritual reality than we imagine. A reality where some beings fell. Others were arrested. Others still fear being sent there. And one day, what is hidden will definitely be confronted. So the question is not just where this prison is. The question is why it needed to exist. Was what happened so serious that it required darkness, chains, and waiting? And if the abyss will be opened, what does that reveal about the coming judgment? Maybe this is the end point, or maybe it's just another door. Because the more we look at this topic, the more we realize that the scriptures do not treat the spiritual world as fantasy. They treat it as reality, an invisible reality, ancient, organized, and full of limits that even demons recognize. Now tell me, if there is a place that even darkness fears, what does this reveal about the power of those who keep this door closed?